The Fool's Gallery presents Chapter 1, The Wavewalker. Taken from the journals of Max Landau. Year 148 DD. 3 days into our voyage. From the first moment I saw her, I fell in love with the endless ocean. I was 8. My mother, on the last legs of her most recent book tour, stopped in the great port city of Sados. It had been 5 grueling months of nothing particularly interesting, and there was no reason to expect this final stop would be any different. I had imagined the tour would be filled with adventure, maybe an attack by a highwayman, or a chance meeting with a mythical creature, a unicorn perhaps, or maybe even a dragon. Instead, our journey was filled with muddy roads, groaning oxen, and long, boring, and all too adult conversations about the morality of war. By the end of it all, I knew that the only place something as grand and gorgeous as a dragon could exist was inside my own imagination, and that the world around me was filled with nothing so wondrous. That is, until I saw the ocean. Her vast emerald water sparkled golden from the setting sun, dwarfing the city she allowed to snuggle coyly by her side. She was a wall where civilization, people, and knowledge simply ended, where everything we thought we knew, everything we assumed, hypothesized, or expected dared not venture, where fact, science, or logic was simply not allowed, where even the great minds of our world, like my mother's, could not even hope to understand, so they simply turned their backs and focused upon more understandable and appetizing things like taxes, insurance, politics, or war. No. The endless ocean was too grand for them. But it was a place for me, a place for imagination, a place where dragons and unicorns could exist. Even at 8, my mother had little time for me, so after we set up her station in the university's book fair, I granted her unspoken wish and disappeared. She had her book to keep her company, and I needed an adventure. I made my way down the dark streets of Sados, not knowing exactly where I was, but always keeping the ocean in front of me. As long as I made it to her waters, it didn't matter how I got there. And find her I did, on the docks of Sados, where the world's greatest ships slept. I walked out on the very edge of the dock and looked south to where the endless ocean extended beyond sight. I knew the legends. No ship dared sail south. Not even the sun dared sail into the endless ocean, for he would get lost and never return to us. But for all my wonder and awe, I suddenly felt afraid. My plan had been to ask a captain if they needed a cabin boy, and then be gone, escaping this boring life to sail off on an adventure. Sailors bustled around me. Captains called for ships to set sail. One of them would take me. I was sure of it. But in that moment, I was afraid. It wasn't a fear of leaving home, or land, or even my mother. No. It was a fear of her. Of the ocean. She was too big, too empty, and I was so small. For all of her beauty, the endless ocean was terrifying. I ran back to my mother and watched her sign the books of young students. We left Sados for home not long after, and I sat in the back of our wagon, watching the ocean shrink and shrink and shrink until it disappeared behind a small grassy hill. I thought I would never see her again, never set foot on those docks and stare into her unending emptiness. Never feel that wonder again. And I didn't. For 20 years. Until now. Now, I find myself sitting at the prow of the Alabaster Queen, writing the first words of my new book. The crew bustles around me as they did on that day on the dock. The first mate yells orders, and the Queen cuts through the waves, sailing south to where even the sun dares not go. Our aim is to explore the unexplorable, to find lands that stretch beyond any map, treasures our banks could not understand, and people who live in different ways. I am here as the ship's scribe. I have inherited little of my mother's literary prowess, but Willis, the expedition's sponsor and my friend, seems to think the job fits me well. I accepted, more to get away from the mess my life had become than any true need for exploration. I had not thought of the ocean for years, but the moment I saw her again, that same awe came upon me, that same wonder, that same fear. I have not seen a dragon yet, nor a unicorn, but something has happened in our first 3 nights on the water that has proved their equal. It happened just mere moments ago. I am breathing hard, having charged below deck, grabbed quill and ink, and begun to write. I need to write now, while the memories are fresh. For if I do not, and I wake tomorrow, I may believe it to be a dream. In truth, it started the night we set sail, but I tricked myself into thinking everything was normal. I can't fool myself anymore. That first night, as the crew went below deck to sleep, I stayed and stared into the ocean. I still couldn't believe I was here, on a ship, leaving behind the horror that had become my life. Looking out into the waves, I felt a surge of possibility. I felt my new life grabbing me, and my old one falling away. The waves softly crashed against the side of the Queen, with a hypnotic rhythm that held me for hours. But the longer I listened, the less I heard waves. Instead, I heard breathing. I heard his breathing, ragged and wet. My past surged up in front of me, and I quickly went below deck, reminding myself of my overactive imagination. After a time, I fell into a deep sleep. The next night I returned, and the ocean breathed around me. I stubbornly stared into her, forcing the waves to sound like waves. But then, something moved out of the corner of my eye. I turned, but it was gone. Unnerved, I returned to my hammock, but this time, no amount of reasoning would lull me to sleep. Then came the third night. Can it possibly have been tonight? It seems a lifetime ago. I once again returned to the railing, stubbornly trying to prove that there was nothing wrong with me. But once again, I heard his breath, and then I saw him, rising up and down with the waves, his bare feet standing firmly on the water. I stumbled backwards, not understanding what I had seen, my mind jumping to the most logical conclusion. I screamed, "Man overboard!" and rushed from the railing, looking to find help. There, at the wheel, stood a figure, the helmsman, I assumed. I rushed to him, but as I drew nearer, I found that it was not the helmsman after all, but the captain. Captain Sophia Destro in all of her glory. Her hat lay off to one side, and a crimson scarf wrapped her head like a bandage, hiding one eye from view. She was leaning on the wheel, softly mumbling to herself, a half-filled bottle of brandy hanging from the tips of her drunken fingers. I considered waking her, but decided against it. I have been on her ship for 3 days, and I have not once seen the captain sober. As I moved back to the railing, the captain hiccuped herself awake, and then raised her bottle in drunken salute to the waves. No, I reasoned. She would be of no help to me, and by now whoever was out there would have drowned. Perhaps it had been no one at all. Perhaps a week with barely any sleep was making me see things. Perhaps... There, at the corner of my eye, there he was again, a figure standing in the ocean, his bare feet resting lightly on the breathing waves, his white shirt slowly turning red. No, it couldn't be. It couldn't. He stood tall as he did in life, his once voluminous hair plastered wet across his sky-blue eyes, his handsome features marred slightly by the opening in his throat. My fingers twitched at the sight of him. It seems they remember better than I do how it feels to cut a throat. I called out his name, Michael, but he did not seem to hear. The ship was passing him by, and slowly he raised his hand to me. I rushed to the back of the boat, yelling his name, Michael, Michael, Michael. But he did not move, slowly slipping into the darkness as the Queen sailed on. I could not bear to see him go. I clambered over the railing, yelling his name, screaming for him to stay, and in my panic I stepped out into nothing. I fell, the hungry waves reaching up to consume me. But in the very last moment, a hand sprang out of the darkness, grabbing hold of my hair and pulling me back onto the hard deck of the Queen. I screamed in pain, crashing pathetically to the deck. I looked up into the surprisingly lucid eye of the captain. She nodded as if to ask if I was done being an idiot. I nodded back, and she shifted her gaze to the ocean. "Your dead get lonely," she said, her voice soft and far away. "You can see them too?" I asked, my voice cracking. A ghostly smile flickered across the captain's face, her lonely eye never leaving the waves. "I can see my own, but my dead don't get lonely. They have all the company they'll ever need." "Do they ever leave you?" I asked. The captain did not respond. Instead, she raised her bottle to the darkness in silent salute and took a deep drink. After a moment of consideration, she held the bottle out to me and said, "Welcome aboard the Alabaster Queen, Mr. Landau." And she moved past me, up to her own vigil behind the wheel, her eye never leaving the dark waters. I followed her gaze back into the darkness and saw Michael waving to me, his ragged breathing slapping against our hull. I raised the captain's bottle in a salute of my own and took a drink. The stuff was vile, and tears streamed from my eyes. I quickly wiped them away, but by the time I did, Michael was gone, disappeared into the night. I took another drink, knowing he will return. Ghosts never really leave us, especially the ones we create. I suppose I'm lucky I only have one. I glanced back at the captain. How many does she see? I don't believe the ocean is as empty to her as it is to me. Together, we keep our lonely vigils, her with her drunkenness, me with my quill and parchment. I sit now, alone on the deck, the sky slowly brightening from the rising sun. I think of Michael and the life I tried to leave behind. It seems I cannot escape so easily. I remember sitting on that dock as a child, staring into the waves. I remember feeling awe, wonder, and fear. And now I find, 20 years later, those same feelings have returned, brought to me on the tide. The Endless Ocean was written and directed by Keenan Ellis. Ambient sound designed by Sword Coast Soundscapes.